Empty. That was the only word for what Rian felt right now. Even as the surrounding horsemen came to a halt and began dismounting, even with the occasional sickening grunts echoing from dying soldiers, and whatever those foul, misshapen creatures had been making, none of it registered. None of it mattered to him. He had lost his friend. The one person who had been on the exact same bewildering path as him. The one person who had given him his absolute trust and shown him genuine compassion when he needed it most. The deepest, most agonizing knife in his heart, however, had been Garth's final words. "My prince." For all he had known since waking up with a fractured mind, he was their general. That was why the vanguard had obeyed him, why people had spent days calling him Sir. But what if that was a hollow fabrication? What if his entire identity had been inverted? Even Adora had acted with a strange deference in his presence, a subtle shift in posture he was only now beginning to understand. A few paces away, Adora was currently standing in a quiet conversation with the surviving elves, their voices low as they discussed what Rian could only assume were their next vital steps on the journey home. The heavy silence was broken by the rhythmic crunch of hooves. A large warhorse trotted up toward them, pulling to a stop a few feet away. Its rider bore the familiar, ornate plume of red and gold feathers upon his helm. The soldier dismounted with a fluid, practiced motion, pulling off his helmet and tucking it securely under his left arm. Locks of shoulder-length, sweat-soaked hair fell across his gaunt, sharply defined features. He possessed a neatly shaped beard and mustache, and he looked down at the mourning group with dark, solemn brown eyes. Recognizing the tragedy before him, the soldier lowered himself to one knee before Garth's body, bowing his head toward the fallen warrior. "This was an unfortunate, terrible loss," the soldier said, his voice deep and heavy with genuine remorse. "I am truly sorry we could not arrive in time to stop this." Rian did not respond. He didn't have the words. A desperate part of him wanted everyone to just leave him entirely alone, to let him grieve in the quiet of the fog. But lingering just beneath the surface of his sorrow, a cold, pragmatic instinct told him he needed to pull himself back to normality. The knight rose slowly to his feet, turning his gaze to Rian. "If it pleases you, Prince, my men can escort you and your kin directly back to your home, if you will allow us the honor of traveling with you." Adora broke away from the other elves, her soft footsteps bringing her over to join the conversation. "We thank you for your timely intervention, sir. Your aid this day shall not be forgotten by the mountain," she said to the man, bowing low in mutual respect. Then her emerald eyes flicked to the resting mounts. "On the matter of escorting us back, however, it might be best if you simply leave us a few fresh horses, if you have any to spare from your ranks." The soldier looked over his shoulder toward the looming, jagged silhouette of the mountain in the distance, then scanned the grim, blood-stained battlefield. "We have strict orders from your people, though, my lady. If anything further were to happen to you on the trail—" Adora shifted, moving suddenly closer to the armored soldier, her posture hardening. "Listen, sir." She trailed off, a flash of frustration crossing her face as she realized she still did not know the man's name. "Sir Tormund of Nostrudor," he supplied instantly, bowing low again. "Tormund," Adora continued, her voice dropping to a firm, unyielding tone. "As I said, we deeply appreciate the blood your men spilt for us today. But you and your soldiers will get no closer to our home than this. Is that entirely clear?" It sounded remarkably like a threat, Rian noted dully. A heavy, volatile silence fell upon the clearing as Tormund and Adora peered intently at one another, neither breaking eye contact. Finally, Tormund let out a weary sigh, easing his rigid posture slightly. "As you wish, milady," he conceded. He turned back toward his company and yelled a booming command. The surrounding cavalrymen immediately went to work, dragging the heavy corpses of men, horses, and the purple-fumed creatures across the turf, stacking them into macabre, meters-high piles. They worked with efficient reverence, making sure to strip their fallen comrades of their weapons and armor, stacking the reclaimed steel in a separate, neat pile. "I would highly advise against burning them here." Adora spoke up softly, her voice carrying across to the closest group of soldiers, who were currently striking flint to ignite a pitch-covered torch. The guardsmen stopped, staring at her blankly through their visors before turning their heads to look at Tormund for direction. Why not? Tormund questioned, his brow furrowing. Standard protocol dictates we burn the casualties to prevent disease. Adora looked around the bleak landscape, her gaze eventually fixing on the dark, misty horizon to the north. This place, the ancient spirits that linger in these valleys, they tend not to stay dead when fire awakens them. The men piling the corpses suddenly faltered, their hands slipping in panic. They dropped the body of a fallen comrade onto the hard earth. The heavy, metallic crash of the steel plate armor rang loudly through the swirling mists, instantly drawing the attention of every soul who hadn't been listening to the conversation. "Have some damn respect, would you?" Tormund roared at his men, his gaunt face flushing with anger. "Or the very next body tossed onto that pile will be yours." The soldiers nodded hastily, murmuring apologies as they returned to their grim duties, leaving the dropped corpse exactly where it lay. Tormund rubbed his temples, letting out a deep, ragged breath. "Very well, then. What do you propose we do, elf?" Adora glanced back at the cluster of elves, then turned her focus to Rian, who still hadn't moved from his spot beside Garth's body, his thumb tracing the edges of the young soldier's necklace. "My kin are heading directly back to the safety of the mountain," Adora explained calmly. "They can direct you and your riders along the safer outskirts of the Bone Wastes. It is a far more secure route for your company to take, because traveling back north the way you originally came, especially now, is a remarkably bad idea." Tormund nodded slowly, processing the tactical advice. "We have a few spare horses from our fallen. Gather whatever supplies you lot manage to salvage and—" "I am not going to the mountain," Rian interrupted. His voice was quiet, but it carried an absolute, spine-chilling finality. He spun the broken strings of Garth's necklace slowly in his hand. An audible, collective gasp erupted from one of the elven women behind them. Another whispered a panicked, "No!" into the wind. "Rian, no, please," Adora said softly, turning to him. She knelt gracefully beside the body, looking down at the young soldier's peaceful, unhelmed face. He looked as though he were merely sleeping. "He can't have died for absolutely nothing," Rian exclaimed, his voice cracking with a sudden, surging rage. "He hasn't, I promise you he hasn't," Adora pleaded, gently placing her pale hand over Rian's white-knuckled grip on the necklace. Rian violently recoiled from her touch, pulling his hand away as he stared at the dirt. "I'm going back to Nostrudor." He flicked his eyes up to Tormund, who was standing tall above him with a profoundly puzzled, suspicious look on his face. "Well, whatever that cursed place truly was." Tormund looked between the boy and Adora, completely bewildered. "What does he mean, Nostrudor? Why would a prince of the mountains speak of the Dark City as if it were his destination?" Adora rose silently, stepping between Tormund and Rian to isolate the conversation. "He was brutally attacked, Commander," she lied smoothly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He was stolen from our people by Varric's raiders not days past. They did something terrible to his mind. I have tried to ease him back into reality, gently, but I deeply worry the magical effects may be permanent." Tormund studied the brooding boy, his eyes tracking the silver blade at Rian's hip. He walked over and knelt briefly beside a fallen soldier, one of Varric's men whose illusion had shattered, revealing the misshapen, purple-fleshed horror beneath the jagged metal patches. "I am truly sorry to hear that," Tormund replied gravely, standing up and placing his gauntlets on his hips. "But it certainly explains a great deal, especially his bizarre behavior during our earlier engagement by the ridge." Rian suddenly jumped to his feet, ignoring their hushed whispers. He turned a fierce, determined gaze toward Adora and the elves standing behind her. "You guys need to go ahead. Please. You're all finally free from the cages. Go home to your families," he said. He turned his back to them, his fingers fumbling blindly as he tried to tie the broken strings of Garth's necklace around his own neck. His hands were shaking violently. He stumbled with the leather strips for several frustrating moments, cursing under his breath as the knots repeatedly failed to catch. Suddenly, a pair of pale, slender hands fell gently over his shoulders. Adora took hold of each frayed end, her fingers working with effortless grace as she swiftly, securely knotted the necklace around his neck. Rian turned around slowly. She was looking up at him, a warm, unbreakable smile resting on her face. "You don't seriously think I would leave your side again, do you, sir?" He knew this would be her exact reaction. He had known the moment he told her to go home that she would refuse, but a protective part of him truly wanted her to be safe within the borders of her own sanctuary. Their people. For the first time since waking up in this broken world, the phrase felt entirely right. The thought settled into his mind as naturally as if it had always been there, a solid anchor amidst the chaotic fog of his memory. Tormund stepped forward, clear anxiety marring his gaunt features as he tried to grab Rian's attention. "Listen to me, sir. I mean, Prince. With all due respect, what you are proposing is absolute madness." He whipped his arm around, pointing vigorously toward the desolate, mist-shrouded north. "Are you seriously telling me you want to march right back the way you came, knowing the horrific nature of what you just fought?" Rian wasn't paying a shred of attention to the knight's warnings. Instead, his eyes were locked entirely on Adora, who was still smiling back at him with an unspoken, defiant loyalty. Tormund let out a sharp, mocking breath, realizing his words were falling on deaf ears. "But then, who am I to question the grand design of your royal highness?" He jested silently to himself, turning on his heel to march back to his warhorse. Over the brief minutes that followed, the camp dissolved into a flurry of departure logistics. Adora spoke a few quiet, commanding words to the remaining elves, who had now begun to mount the fresh white steeds Tormund's men had surrendered. She gave them explicit instructions. They were to guide Tormund and his cavalry along the dangerous outskirts of the Bone Wastes, keeping them close to the waterfront along the northern borders of Aethelgard, the very continent they were currently standing on. They would see the soldiers safely to the borders of the southern bridge before returning to the mountain to inform the High Elders of everything that had transpired. Once the elves departed into the fog, Adora returned to Rian's side. Together, using his ornate silver sword and a heavy iron blade she had scavenged from a fallen footman, they began the backbreaking work of digging into the earth. They carved a deep, clean grave into the soil, and together they gently lowered Garth's body into the ground. Once he had been placed deep enough within the earth, they filled the grave back in, smoothing the loose dirt until a neat mound was formed. Together, they gathered heavy gray stones from the surrounding ruins, stacking them carefully to form a protective cairn. As the final stone was placed, Adora leaned forward. With the tip of her blade, she gracefully carved a series of intricate looping symbols into the rock face markings of an origin completely unknown to Rian. She then closed her eyes, bowing her head as she began to recite a few soft, rhythmic words in the fluid musical language of the elves. It was a beautiful, comforting melody, and Rian found himself wishing with a hollow ache that he could understand the meaning behind the sounds. Adora opened her eyes, looking across the grave at Rian as they stood together in the damp wind. "It'll come back to you in time," she said softly, her voice carrying an absolute certainty. "The words of our kin." Rian let out a long, heavy sigh and bowed his head to the stones. "Goodbye, my friend," Rian whispered into the silence of the cairn. "I promise you, Garth, I will not rest until I recover exactly what was stolen from me." He paused, his gaze lifting to meet Adora's fierce green eyes. "From us." One of Tormund's remaining scouts led two large, magnificent white steeds over to them, silently handing a leather rein to each of them. They both immediately mounted the horses, checking the straps of their weapons and securing the small supply packs Tormund had gifted them. Rations containing dried meats, winter fruits, and a heavy leather waterskin. They guided their horses back toward the head of the departing cavalry column, where Tormund was just about to slide his plumed helmet back over his face. "We will not forget your kindness, Sir Tormund," Rian said, offering a formal, authoritative nod from his saddle. "I only hope this blood spent proves to your kindred that the true men of the West want peace as much as you do," Tormund replied smoothly, adjusting his gauntlets. Adora rode her mount ahead slightly, her eyes tracking the long line of riding soldiers as they were led away by the elven guides, their silhouettes slowly dissolving into the rolling gray mists. "Our ancient quarrel is no longer with the kingdoms of the West," Adora spoke aloud, her voice carrying a chilling weight. "In truth, I feel both our peoples now share a far greater worry, a terror regarding the unspoken truth of what truly lies to our north." Rian felt an icy chill run straight down his spine. From those brief, ominous words, a terrifying realization washed over him. Even Adora didn't fully comprehend what monstrosity occupied the northern wastes. For as far as his fractured memory served, or rather, as far as he had been forcefully told, the vanguard had been heading north, and the Elven Mountain lay to the north. But it had all been an elaborate, calculated lie, a brilliant manipulation woven by Varric to keep him blind. But why did they take me in the first place? Rian asked himself, his fingers tightening on the reins. Of all the people in Aethelgard, why did they choose a prince for whatever dark ritual they were planning? These were burning questions he would eventually have to ask Adora once their long journey truly began. For now, he sat silently on his steed, watching the mist swallow the western soldiers one by one. "Farewell, Prince," Tormund called out before spurring his horse to a gallop to catch the head of his column, vanishing entirely into the gloom. Rian and Adora waited in total silence until the last echoes of the cavalry had faded, leaving them entirely alone on the desolated highway. They both took one final, lingering look back at the stone cairn marking Garth's grave before turning their horses toward the road ahead, facing the ancient, broken bridge that awaited them in the fog.